worked at a small local diner for a year back in 2019. It was just a regular ordinary restaurant, and I was a server there. The place closed at 10 every night, but my shift actually ended at 11 because I had to clean all the tables in the back room before heading home. It was a normal night of closing alone, and I just locked the doors at 10 p.m. I began wiping down the tables, but after just a couple seconds, several loud knocks came from the front door. It made me jump, but I looked over and saw a man standing there, looking through the glass door. I spoke loudly, telling him the place was closed for the night. This has happened before, so it wasn't much of a big deal, but the guy stayed there for a little bit as if he didn't understand what I said. I walked closer to the door.
Sorry, the store closed at 10. We aren't taking any more orders tonight.
I spoke even louder this time, so I knew he heard me. The guy looked at me for a second with no reaction, before making a slight smile and turning around as he walked away. I thought he might have been drunk or something, but I forgot about it after a couple minutes and continued with my work. I finished cleaning all the tables and started wiping down the front counter when I saw out of the corner of my eye a figure moving towards the front door, followed by knocking again. It was the same guy from 15 minutes ago, standing right outside, looking through the door at me. I'd never had someone do this before, so I was more annoyed this time. I raised both of my arms up as in a "what are you doing" kind of gesture. The man, still staring at me, knocked again. I told him with a very loud and strict voice that we were closed and he needed to leave. This time though, he looked very bothered by what I had said. He tensed up, then gave the door a small push as if to test if it was locked or not, before walking away.
What the hell is wrong with that guy?
I said out loud to myself as I walked towards the front windows to make sure that he was leaving the area. I didn't see him anywhere in the parking lot, so I figured he was gone for good. I checked the time and was slightly annoyed as it was later than I was hoping, but just as I began walking over to the counter, a sudden loud bang came from the restaurant's back door. I froze in fear as I wasn't confident whether or not the back door was locked, but a couple seconds later they began hitting the door over and over. Knowing now that the door was locked, I knew I needed to leave while I still had the chance. I sprinted out the front door and got my car, calling the police as fast as I could. After a minute or two, I could see through the restaurant window as the man appeared and began looking through the whole building. Then he tried to open the cash register, but I think he gave up after a few tries, and then he disappeared to the back of the store. Once the police arrived, they made sure the man was gone and then got the whole story from me. The back door had huge dents in it, and the door handle was almost completely gone, clearly having been beaten by a hammer or something. But other than that, there wasn't much damage, or even anything stolen aside from the tip jar that we kept at the front counter. I just find it crazy that some people are willing to do these sort of things just for a couple extra bucks. Who knows what he would have done if I had stood in his way. I spent most of my 20s working at a variety of stores as a stocker, basically just putting products on shelves all day. After a few years though, I took a job at a common pet store that required me to work at multiple locations. I'd basically get a small van full of boxes every day, and I'd drive to all the stores in the area and fill their shelves, then drop the van off at the warehouse when I finished. The thing about this job though was that I'd pick up the van at 2 p.m., and so I wouldn't get out until 12. But most nights it would take much longer, and I'd have to do 1 to 2 hours of overtime. This wasn't too big of a deal for me, because with the overtime I was making really good money, but the shift did make it hard to have a normal life. Anyways, I had been doing it for several months already, and it was just like every other shift. It was 11 p.m. and I was heading to the last store, which meant I probably wouldn't get back to the warehouse until 1 a.m. Obviously, the pet stores closed at 9, so I'd always be the only one there. There was a small dock in the back that I could pull my van next to, and then take my dolly out and roll the boxes in, so I pulled up as usual and unlocked the door to the building. I rolled in 3 large stacks of boxes and began moving each box to the aisle that the product belonged to when I heard a small thud from the front of the store. I looked up and stood there quietly for a few seconds, then went back to work after there were no more noises. I did get creeped out sometimes when working in the stores alone at night, but I'd gotten used to it at this point. When the buildings are quiet, you can hear sound you normally don't, like the air conditioning turning on and off, so I figured the noise was just another random sound that the building made. I finished unloading the boxes to the aisles and began opening them and stocking the product. I was probably halfway done and nearly 45 minutes in when I heard the distinct sound of a single cough echo through the building. I froze, staring at the front of the store again. I could feel my heart instantly start racing as I was absolutely terrified. Nobody was supposed to be here, and I knew that if they didn't have bad intentions, then they would have said something when I came in. After waiting for almost a minute, I slowly and quietly started stepping towards the back door. Once I made it outside, I shut the door and locked it. Feeling much safer now, I got into my van and pulled my phone out to call 911. Just as I did that, I heard footsteps rushing towards the door from the inside, followed by the door handle moving slightly. The door was key locked, so I knew they wouldn't be able to open it, but it was still terrifying and made my adrenaline start pumping. Then, loud, harsh banging and possibly even kicking came from the other side of the door. The man started yelling, pleading with me to let him out. I could hear the anger and rage in his voice. I didn't respond and hurried to call the police. As I was on the phone, the man was swearing and cursing, repeatedly hitting the door and aggressively trying to get it open. Once the operator said the police were on their way, I turned the van on and moved further down, away from the door. I know I should have been safe and just driven far away, but part of me wanted to make sure that this guy didn't escape before the police arrived. Thankfully, they got here pretty quick. I met them at the door, which was now quiet, and gave them the key. The 3 officers went in, and a couple minutes later they came out with a man in handcuffs. He was found with a pretty big knife on him, but nothing else. I think that's the weirdest part of this whole situation, and the thing that I think about the most. The man was hiding in a store with a knife and didn't steal anything. I'd never seen the man before, so I don't know why he'd want to harm me, but it seems like that might be the only explanation. It's scary to think that I could have been just a few feet away from something horrible, but at least now I don't have to worry about what his true intentions were. For almost 3 years, I worked overnight at a fast food restaurant as the driver-through attendant. My college class schedule was unusual and was only part-time, so working overnight actually made my life a lot easier to get schoolwork done during the day. For the most part, my shifts would go by slow and would be very uneventful. However, sometimes strange things would happen. My manager always did his best to make sure 2 people were scheduled overnight, but every once in a while we'd have to be alone for the night. Thankfully, most of the weird things would happen with my coworker there with me, but with this one incident I wasn't so lucky. My main coworker that worked overnights with me was taking his vacation week, so that left me alone 3 out of the 5 night shifts that I worked that week. My first 2 nights went as usual with no problems. It was slow and all the drive-through customers' orders were small and simple. On the 3rd night, it started out slow as well, with only 5 to 10 customers coming every hour, ordering a small snack or a drink. Then around 2 a.m., there was a long break of nobody showing up for almost 45 minutes. I kept my headset on in case someone pulled into the drive-thru, but decided to start cleaning while I had extra time. There wasn't really anything else to do, so cleaning was my way of passing the time. I'm not really sure how long I was cleaning for, as I was never interrupted. But I passed by the front counter at one point and noticed bright headlights shining through the front window of the store. The car was parked right outside the doors. Our restaurant's dining room closed at 9 p.m. every night and only kept the drive-thru open, so it was a little weird that someone was parked there. But of course, I didn't really think too much of it, as they could have just parked to pull up directions on their iPhone or something. So I continued with my cleaning. A few minutes later, though, my headset beeped, signaling that a customer was in the drive-thru lane. I quickly made my way to the window and asked how I could help them. A man spoke softly, asking for a large soda. I told him to pull forward, then began pouring his fountain drink as usual. The guy pulled up really quickly, though, so I was still pouring the drink. I could see in the corner of my eye that he was looking in the window at the restaurant. Some people did this, but I never understood why because it makes it really awkward. But I finished up and handed him the drink. He gave me exact change, then I thanked him, telling him to have a good night as I stepped away and went back to cleaning. I wiped down a few counters and reorganized a small shelf, but as I passed by the window, I jumped back a little, as the man was still there, staring at me.
Did you need something else, sir?
He didn't respond for a moment, not even reacting to my question, before he finally said no and drove away. The guy must have been sitting there looking in the window for a whole 5 minutes while I was cleaning, which was really creepy and weird, but I knew the doors to the restaurant were locked, so I still felt somewhat safe. Again, I kept my headset on and went over to the front counters to wipe them down. A few more minutes go by before there's a beep in the headset again, but when I got to the computer and asked what they wanted, nobody answered. I asked again, and still got no response, so I turned around and looked at the cameras behind me that showed live footage of the drive-thru line. Strangely, the car passed the ordering station and was stopped several feet behind the window I was standing at. I looked closer and could recognize the car as the man from just a few minutes ago. At this point, I was starting to get pretty nervous, so I backed away from the window and stood around the corner. The way I was positioned, I was out of sight from the window, but I could still see the footage from the camera. I couldn't tell what the guy in the car was doing, but I could see movement in the grainy video. A minute later, he pulls the car up quickly and starts banging on the window aggressively. I was startled, but after a few moments, he speeds his car out of the drive-thru lane and parks right in front of the front door. The driver door swings open and the man gets out, holding something in his hand as he quickly approaches the front door. I immediately grabbed the store phone and called 911 as the man aggressively shook the handles, trying to force the locked doors open. Thankfully, he gave up after a few tries and ran back to his car, driving away. The police made sure I was okay when they arrived, and I told them what had happened. From what I heard, they came back in the morning to speak with my manager and collect the camera footage so that they could get a license plate. I was never updated on the situation after that, so I'm not really sure if he was caught. I've always assumed the man was attempting a robbery, but there's no way to know for sure. Being alone that night made me an easy target, though, and a lot of horrible things could have happened, and there would have been no one there to help me.
The $5 Big Breakfast Deal is back at Wawa. Get any sizzly, any size hot or iced coffee, and a crispy hash brown, all for just $5. The $5 Big Breakfast Deal is back. Gotta have a Wawa.
Well, the holidays have come and gone once again, but if you've forgotten to get that special someone in your life a gift, well, Mint Mobile is extending their holiday offer of half off unlimited wireless. So here's the idea. You get it now, you call it an early present for next year, like 11.
I worked as a security guard at a large hotel in Las Vegas during my late 20s. It paid way better than pretty much any other job nearby that I was actually qualified for, but the most annoying part about it was the scheduling and the staff. At the time, the building was having trouble with a lack of staff to cover shifts, so my schedule would be mornings, evenings, or overnights, all randomly throughout the week. It made it really hard to even sleep sometimes, but again, I liked the money. Anyways, I was working a late evening shift this night and was at the front desk talking to two of my coworkers. It was around 11, and my shift ended at 12, so we were just passing the time. In the middle of our conversation, the phone rang on the desk that I was leaning on. Checking the number, it was from one of the rooms in the hotel, so I picked it up and asked how I could help them. A man spoke, saying that there was something going on in one of the rooms down the hall and that he was really worried about it. I asked him what he meant, and he frantically responded, telling me to come up quick because he was getting really nervous. I checked the room number on the phone, then told him I would send security up as soon as possible. Of course, though, I was just referring to myself. When I put the phone down, I quickly explained the strange nature of the call to my coworkers, then headed to the elevators and went to the mid-level floor where the caller's room was located. Walking down the hallway, there was a strange sense of absolute silence. I expected to hear whatever the caller was talking about, but there were no loud noises coming from anywhere on the floor. I also kind of expected the caller to have been standing by their door, waiting for me or something, but the door was closed. I knocked on the door, loudly announcing that it was hotel security. I didn't hear any movement or sounds coming from the room at all, and after a minute of no answer, I walked down to the end of the hallway, listening intently for anything unusual, then continued back to the door, knocking again. A few moments later, though, the room behind me opened their door, and an older woman asked if I was security. I said yes, and asked if they knew anything about a strange noise or the caller from the room, to which they replied that they had heard loud noises traveling through the hallway a few minutes ago, but were unsure what it was. From their voice and facial expressions, they seemed really terrified. At this point, I was already starting to get really nervous, but things only got stranger. I grabbed my walkie and radioed down to the front desk, asking them to call the room again and let me know if they answered. After a little bit, they replied that nobody answered. I stood there for a moment, trying to think of what to do, before radioing back down to them. I told them to check who was staying in the room. After waiting for what felt like forever, they finally got back to me, saying that nobody had the room booked for tonight. Even more confused, I took out my security key card and opened the door since nobody was supposed to be there. The room looked clean and unused as far as I could tell. I searched every corner and found basically nothing. But then I walked over to the phone. I turned it over and got the serial number on it. Then I went back down to the lobby where my desk was, and I checked the security records for timestamps of calls that had been made from that room. Sure enough, there was a record of an active call having been made from this room to the front desk, the one that I had answered about 15 minutes ago. Obviously, the hotel didn't record the calls or anything, so all I was able to confirm was that someone was in that vacant room without permission. This ended up becoming a bigger investigation over the coming days, as the next morning, one of the guests staying in a room on that same floor was reported missing by a family member that was staying in a separate room. The security footage of all the entrances and exits were reviewed, and the missing person was last seen leaving the hotel alone a couple hours prior to the call that I had received. It's still unclear if the two incidents were connected or not, but it's definitely a really strange situation. I don't know how the caller got access to that phone, or who they were, but personally I believe that the reason they called seemed to add up with someone getting forcefully kidnapped, based on their brief description. The person behind the mystery call was never identified, and as of right now, the missing person still has not been found. This happened to me during a business trip that I took last year for work. I arrived at the hotel and picked up my key to the room, which my company had paid for. It was a nice-looking hotel on the inside, though a bit smaller than most other hotels. There were maybe 30 to 40 rooms total, and only 3 stories. My room was on the top floor, so I took the elevator up and started making my way down the hallway. I put my bags down by the door and reached into my pocket for the room key. But just as I did that, the neighboring room's door opens and a man steps into the hall. He greeted me, mentioning that he was my neighbor, and held his hand out, gesturing for a handshake. I confusingly shook it and told him my name, then started making my way into the room. As I walked in, I noticed that he went back into his room as well and shut the door. I thought it was strange that someone would come out of their temporary hotel room just to greet me as their temporary neighbor, but some people are just like that, I guess. I unpacked my small suitcase and duffel bag, then laid on the bed and turned on the TV. It was pretty late already, and I was tired from the flight, so I planned on going to bed early that night. I took a quick shower, then turned off all the lights. I laid there, trying to sleep for almost 20 minutes, before hearing the neighbor's door creak open, followed by seeing their shadow walk by my door, but they stopped just before they passed my room. Through the sliver of light under the door, I could see their shadow get closer for a second, before backing away and continuing down the hall. This obviously creeped me out, so I got up and made sure that all the locks were secured on the door, then went back to bed. The next day, I went to meet my coworkers at a company-owned building where we attended a presentation and had dinner. I didn't get back to the hotel until 10 p.m., and I was really exhausted. I tossed my work bag on the bed and then got in the shower. I was in there for maybe 10 minutes, when through the water splashing, I heard the distinct beep sound of the electronic door lock unlocking. I knew it was too late for it to be the cleaning services, so my mind instantly jumped to the strange man staying in the room next to mine, but I didn't know how he could possibly have a key card that could unlock my door. Not knowing what to do, I stood there silently as I listened to the door slowly open and then close, followed by footsteps walking past the bathroom door. With the shower running, I knew that they had to know that I was in there, which terrified me even more. I tried to quietly step out of the shower as to not alarm them. Then I quietly put on a pair of pants that I had laying on the ground. Making sure to lock it, I leaned my ear up against the bathroom door and listened. I could hear a faint noise, sounding like someone was searching through one of my bags. Of course I wanted to confront them, but for all I knew, they could have a gun or a knife. In the moment, I really just felt helpless and frozen in fear. I had no idea what this guy could want from me, but soon the room went silent. While I didn't have my phone with me, I figured my best bet was to call for help. At the very least, it would hopefully get the guy to run away. I took a deep breath, then started banging on the bathroom door, yelling for help as loud as I could. I could hear the man's frantic footsteps run past the door and back into the hallway. I quickly got out and closed the front door, locking it shut, then ran to the nightstand to get my phone and dialed 911 with my shaky hands. Once they were on their way, I called the front desk to let them know as well. Of course, by the time they got here, the man was already gone, but thankfully the police found him in his car a few hours later. I'm not sure if he even got any jail time for his actions though, because they couldn't prove his motive to be harmful. I honestly think he was trying to kidnap me or something though, as I don't know any other reason why he would go into the room when he knew that I was in there. But I guess we'll never know for sure what would have happened. My family would take yearly vacations to a different hotel and resort every summer. It would always be me, my wife, and my 2 little boys. For the most part, we would spend all of our time at the resort rather than going out and visiting other places. It made it cheaper since we didn't need to rent a car, and it was just relaxing to stay at a nice place and get away from everyday life. Of course, when we first arrived in the morning, we all unpacked and the kids immediately wanted to go to the water park. My wife and I sat on the chairs around the pool, while the boys went off and played with the other kids at the water park that was right next to the pool. We sat there enjoying the sun for about 2 hours before we both decided we should get back to our room so we could get ready to go out for dinner. I got up and began walking around the water park looking for the boys, and after a few minutes I was able to find Sam, the older of the two, and asked him where Alan was. I changed both of their names for privacy reasons. Sam said that Alan was playing with another kid on the other side of the park. I told Sam we were leaving and to run back to Mom while I went to find Alan. I was searching, walking around like an idiot for probably 10 minutes, starting to get nervous when I finally saw him. He was in the back corner where a few chairs were set up and was talking to a small boy that looked about his age. Sitting in the chairs next to him was a couple, seeming to be the boy's parents. I walked up and briefly introduced myself, but they didn't respond, aside from giving me a slight smile. There was was an awkward couple seconds of silence. Then I told Alan that we were leaving for dinner and led him back to the hotel. I asked him about who his new friend was, and he said he was playing with him at the water park, but that was pretty much it. Alan was a pretty talkative kid, so it was nothing out of the ordinary, but then he told me something strange. He said that the boy introduced him to his parents, who then invited him for dinner tonight. I found it really strange that someone would invite a young boy to dinner without even talking to the boy's parents. I told my wife as soon as we got up to the room, and she was also really worried about it. We ended up going somewhere quick for dinner, and got back to the hotel around 5. The kids both seemed pretty exhausted, so we were ready to just relax for the rest of the night. We got in the elevator and made our way up to our floor. But as the elevator doors opened, Alan's new friend and his mother were standing there as if they were waiting for the elevator to go down. As soon as we got out, the mother looked at me with a short smile and asked if Alan could join them for dinner tonight. I briefly looked at my wife, who seemed just as confused and concerned as I was. Then I looked back at the lady.
We already had dinner tonight, but maybe we can work something out for tomorrow.
Her smile faded as she turned and walked down the opposite hallway, I assumed to their room. I knew both me and my wife thought the same thing, that they were creepily waiting for us by the elevator the whole time just to ask about dinner. When we got inside our room, we pulled Alan aside and strictly told him to not go near that family without one of us with him. He seemed a bit upset about it, but he agreed. I also pulled Sam aside separately and made sure he knew of the situation and that I wanted him to look after his little brother if ever we weren't around. We all took turns showering, then relaxed on the bed and couch for the rest of the night. I was pretty annoyed at how the vacation was going already, having to be stressed out for my child's safety, but I assured myself it would be better tomorrow. Eventually, we all got ready for bed and turned out the lights. There were 2 beds in the room, one that my wife and I slept on, and the other for the 2 boys to share. A few hours into the night, I was shaken awake. I jolted up, as I guess I was pretty on edge, and I saw Sam next to me, still shaking my arm.
You okay, bud?
Sam responded quietly, whispering to me that Alan was talking to someone at the door. I immediately jumped out of bed and turned the corner leading to the front door. From the short glimpse I got before yelling at him, I could tell he was in the process of figuring out how to unlock the door, and I could hear a faint voice on the other side. I sprinted towards him, screaming for him to back away from the door. Alan jumped back, frightened by the volume of my voice. I slammed against the door, hearing footsteps sprinting down the hall as I finished unlocking the door and swung it open. I know I should have just stayed in the room and called for help, but I was in such a rage that all I wanted was to confront the creep. Entering the hallway, I saw a quick figure of a man turn the corner down the hall towards the elevators. I tried to catch up, but once I turned the corner, there was no sight of him. He wouldn't have had time to take the elevator, so I knew he was staying in a room on that floor. After looking around for a few minutes, I ran back to our room and met my wife, who was already awake due to the chaos of the situation. I told her to lock the door, as I was going to go to the front desk to inform them of the incident. By the time I got down to the lobby, my adrenaline was starting to fade out and I was trying to calm myself down so I could explain what happened. There was a young woman at the counter that I talked to, and I could tell she had never dealt with a situation like this. She called a security guard over to talk to me, as well as her manager. After a few minutes of discussion though, it was pretty clear that they couldn't do much about it. They had no security cameras in the hallways, only on the entrances and exits. I didn't have any proof, nor description of the man at the door, or his relation to the parents who asked about dinner. Obviously, I assumed it was the father of the other boy, but even though I felt like I knew for sure the intention of the creepy parents, I couldn't really prove it. In short, the best they could do was give a refund for the remaining days, so we had to move to a different resort 30 minutes away. It's a really terrible feeling as a parent to know that there was someone likely trying to kidnap your child, and yet there is nothing anyone can do about it. I hate knowing that those creepy parents are probably out somewhere right now trying to get unknowing children into some weird trap of theirs. Those people deserve to rot in prison, and I hope that me sharing this experience can inform other parents of the true dangers, and hopefully help save their children from these horrible people. What freaks me out the most is the possibility of the boy that was with them being someone else's missing child, who they now use to lure in other innocent children. was 21. I went on a vacation to Washington. It was somewhere I'd been dreaming of going since I was a kid. My plans were to hang out around Seattle and stay in the city for the most part, but I figured it was only right to go camping in the massive forest and woods that Washington had to offer. I only wanted to camp for a night and then head back to the city. I'd been camping a few times before, but never on my own, so this was a first. I rented out some camping gear from a local shop and found a small trail with camping grounds. I drove down there and got going as soon as the sun was up. The path to the camping grounds was very easy and took me less than 3 hours. It was basically just a flat plot of land that had some clear signs of previous campers being there, like old equipment, rusty cooking pots, and some trash. I set up my tent off to the side next to a tree where the area was clear. As far as I knew, there weren't any special sights to see nearby, so I was just there to chill and be at peace. At sunset, I got a fire going and brought out my Ziploc bag that I had prepared full with s'mores ingredients. I made an unhealthy amount, and when I was done, I just sat next to the campfire and spent some time thinking. That was until I was interrupted. A man came up behind me from seemingly nowhere and sat at the other end of my campfire.
Oh, hey, you camping around here too?
I asked, trying to make the strange encounter less awkward. He looked at me, but he didn't respond to my question. I looked around behind me and to the sides to see if anyone else was here, but it was just us. A moment went by before he stood up and walked away. I don't recall if I was more nervous, creeped out, or confused, but nonetheless I stayed there and kept my eyes open for the next hour. Eventually I put my fire out and went inside my tent, staying up for another hour before falling asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound, the crackle of a campfire. I opened my eyes and saw the orange light flickering in front of my tent. My heartbeat grew faster and louder as I unzipped the tent. My campfire had been rekindled, and 4 men sat around it, all looking directly at me. One of them was the same man who'd come by previously. I slowly stepped out of the tent and looked at each of them in horror. Before I could say anything, one of them spoke something in a foreign language, and then 2 of them got up and grabbed me, patting me down and taking my phone and wallet. These guys were way bigger than me, and there was no point in resisting. After a good search, they then dragged me away from the campsite. We walked for a good 20 minutes out into the woods, and I was holding back tears, pretty sure this was the end. But then they shoved me on the ground, hit me over the head, and ran away. I think they were trying to knock me out, or at least daze me enough to not follow them, but I felt like it was pretty obvious that given the circumstances, I wasn't going to go strolling back toward them. I got up and immediately started jogging in the direction that I thought would take me closer to the interstate that ran between the forest. Once all the adrenaline was out though, my head was killing me and it was hard to think straight. Not to mention, it was pitch black and I was stumbling over fallen logs and tree roots and had no way of knowing if I was walking straight or not. Then, I'd say about 30 minutes into walking, I passed out. It was likely from a mix of everything, but when I regained consciousness, I realized that I had even less of an idea of which direction to go in. I walked in what I prayed was the right direction, knowing that there was a chance that I could just get even more lost. After an hour of seeing nothing but large trees and dark woods, I spotted a light in the distance. It was a flashlight, moving around like someone was carrying it. As I approached, I screamed for help, only to see the figure of a man turn toward me and shine the light in my direction, followed by 3 more figures appearing behind him. Without hesitating, I sprinted away, but they didn't seem to follow me. From that encounter, although scaring the shit out of me again, I saw the way they were walking and was able to keep myself going in that direction. 2 more hours of walking, and at the break of dawn, I reached the interstate. After another half hour, I finally waved down a car and was safe from there. After getting back to the city and contacting police, I got my car back and gave the officers the best description of the events that I could give. I still had to pay for the lost rental items, but that was far from the worst of it. Lucky for me, the men who robbed and attacked me didn't seem to be in the killing business, but leaving me out in a vast forest like that in the middle of the night was giving me slim chances at best. As odd as it sounds, if I hadn't seen them for a second time, although as horrifying as it was, it's likely the only reason I'm still here today. I was on a road trip heading back from a job interview I had across the states. I stayed for an extra couple days to make it a mini vacation, which was why I drove instead of taking a plane. Anyway, it was pouring outside, which would usually make for a relaxing drive, but it was the middle of the night, so it made visibility difficult. Most of the drive consisted of going through dense forest on long one-lane roads. The drive was supposed to be around 10 hours, and obviously with rain, I expected a slight delay. It was just past 1 a.m. when I checked my phone and saw it was 62 miles until the next turn. For some reason though, Apple Maps was taking me on a different route from the way I'd taken before. I didn't see it as a problem at all, and continued for a while, maybe 30 minutes before I glanced over at my phone again. It still said I was 62 miles away from the next turn. I looked closer and my car wasn't even moving on the map. I tried clicking on it and restarting the app, but it was frozen on that screen. To make things worse, all it said was, "Turn right in 62 miles," with no road or street name. Without that, I had no idea where I was going or when to turn, other than a tiny memory of a street name it had shown me before. It was one of those where if I saw the street sign, then I'd recognize and remember it, but I couldn't fully remember it on my own. Despite the inconvenience, I continued driving for a while in hopes that it was just an internet connection thing, and once I was out of the dense forest, it would fix itself. An hour or so of driving later, I was still in the forest and the rain was still pouring down, but I saw an intersection coming up. On the connecting street, there was a truck parked on the side, and I figured they were probably having the same problem I was having. I slowed and looked at the street sign, and to my surprise, I thought I actually recognized it. It could have just been some coincidence or a false memory due to my lack of sleep, but I ended up turning and taking my chances. At first, I was fairly confident in my choice, thinking I might have actually made the right call, but after an hour of driving, I was still in the forest. I knew for sure that I didn't spend even nearly this much time driving through the forest on the way there, so something was wrong. I checked my phone and still had no luck, but up ahead I saw a faint glow of a billboard sign. A motel, right there in the middle of this isolated forest. It seemed like an odd choice for a motel, but I pulled into the parking lot so I could safely figure out my situation. The whole lot was empty, not a single car. A minute later though, that same truck I'd seen back at the intersection pulled in and parked a few spots down. I couldn't see much through the rain, so I just ignored them and continued with trying to get my phone to work. I want to say I probably sat there for 15 minutes before giving up. Just before deciding to go into the motel to either ask for help or get a room, a knock at my window startled me.
Hey, can you help me?
He yelled through the rain. I rolled the window down a crack, letting rain splash all over me as I asked what he wanted. He said he needed some directions and told me a very specific address, as if I were to know where it was.
Sorry, man. I'm just as lost as you are.
He frowned, then smiled and said to have a nice night, walking back through the rain to his truck. After a minute, I got out and ran into the motel. The front room was dark and empty. Nobody was at the desk. I leaned over the counter to see if someone was in the back, but then the front door opened behind me. I turned and saw that man from the truck outside. He was soaked, with water dripping from his long hair and beard. The look on his face was cold and sinister, and he had one hand suspiciously shoved in his pocket. In that instant, I quickly tried walking past him. He stayed firmly in my way, but for whatever reason, he didn't stop me from squeezing past him and out the door. As I quickly walked to my car, I heard the man exit the building behind me and his footsteps catching up. I got in and turned on my car just as the man came up to my window, and through the rain, I heard the sound of my door latch click. Thank God my car auto-locks, because as soon as I heard that and looked up at him, he stared at me with disturbingly rage-filled eyes and began forcefully trying to open the door. He was pulling so hard, the entire car was rocking back and forth. I pulled out and drove off so fast I almost ran him over. I got back to the intersection and sped down the way I was going before. Thankfully, I made it to a city after 20 miles and was able to get help. It turned out the motel I was at had closed down a couple months back, and for some reason the sign still worked, which nobody could explain to me. I don't know what that man's intentions were, and whether or not he had planned that whole thing out, but one thing I am sure of is that I got very lucky with my escape from that motel. I lived on my own for the first time in my life when I turned 25. It made me want to explore doing other things by myself too, and one thing I'd always wanted to do was go for a long hike. It might sound a little weird, but it was just something that I thought sounded like an accomplishment to do solo. I had no experience in any outdoorsy activities, so this was my first big trail. Online it said it was 8 hours, so I packed as much water and food as I could, and on Monday morning I set out on the hike. The first thing I noticed when I started walking was how thin the trail was. I didn't know if this was normal or not, but it was barely wide enough to walk on without stepping on the borders of the trail. While being thin, it was still very defined, and I knew I'd be back well before dark, so I wasn't worried about it. Although I didn't do much hiking, I was still in decent shape, so walking long distances wasn't an issue. Most of the way up the trail, I was feeling great and having no problem, but as I kept going, it did start to wear me down a bit. I checked my watch constantly, and once I was 6 hours in and still hadn't reached the end, I was starting to worry. Supposedly, the end of the trail was a small overlook of the valley, so there was no way I could just walk past it or miss it somehow. But according to the website I'd seen earlier, I was 2 hours behind. Then I started to think maybe it meant the trail was 8 hours to complete one way and was not including the walk back. But I just knew that I had to turn back at this point if I wanted to be out of the forest before dark. I turned around and began walking back the way I came. As I walked back, I noticed a few things that I hadn't noticed on the way up. Specifically, there was a line of footprints that went perpendicular to the path, going right across from one end of the forest to the other, and just kept going as far as I could see. I thought maybe I didn't see it before because of the different point of view, but I was already a bit worried, and this wasn't helping my case. Then, 3 hours into the hike back, and nearly 9 hours total being in the forest, the trail I was walking on started to widen. One thing I knew for sure was that the trail was thin the entire time up, so when I saw this, my stomach tightened. I didn't know how, but I had gotten onto the wrong trail, maybe taken a side path accidentally. I stood there like a terrified child for a few minutes, unsure of my next move. The sun was already setting, and if I had taken the wrong turn in the daytime, how would I make sure to follow my way back and not make the same mistake in the dark? I knew my choices were limited, so I had to turn back again and hope for the best. I started walking, but not long into it, I saw footprints again. Not the same ones from before, and I knew these weren't there just 10 minutes ago. I looked out into the forest in the direction they were going, but it was now too dark to see much. Soon, I couldn't see anything. The moonlight provided a dim overcast, but I hadn't packed a flashlight. It was the middle of April too, so the nights would get pretty cold where I lived. As I walked, the only sound was my footsteps on the gravel and the soft noises the forest made. That was until I heard something ahead. Someone else walking on the gravel. I stopped and stared ahead into the dark, but after a few steps, the sound went away. I carefully moved forward until I saw the footprints in the gravel going straight across the trail. I turned my phone light on and pointed it into the forest. It was still too dim, but I knew someone was out there.
Hello?
I called out. There was nothing but silence. I held my phone light up still, and after a moment, I saw a very slight fog from someone's cold breath rise from behind a nearby tree. They were maybe 10 feet away from me into the forest, but seeing as they were hiding made me scared as to what they were up to and why exactly they didn't want to be seen. I quickly walked further down the trail, and after 30 minutes, I found where I had accidentally turned off. Several hours later, I made it out and got to my car. I hated myself for weeks after that, for having gotten myself into such a bad situation, but it only got worse. I think it was exactly 3 weeks since my hike when I saw on the news that 2 bodies were found in the forest I had hiked in. They didn't give exact locations, but it was in the area near the trail I had taken. I don't think they found who had done it, but I'm almost positive that at one point I was standing just 10 feet away from them, close enough to see their cold breath in the dark. It was last winter, and I was living alone in a small neighborhood home. It was one of those places where everything beyond the backyard turned into trees and undeveloped land. I'd lived there for about a year by then, and never really had any issues. It was quiet, which I liked, and even though it was on the older side, it still felt like a nice, cozy home. This happened over a long weekend, where it was snowing on and off, and extremely cold outside, often below zero, so I was at home and inside all day. This night, after eating dinner and cleaning up around the house, I watched TV for a bit and eventually turned everything off and went to bed around 11. One thing I have to mention about the bedroom is that for the last 3 or so months before this happened, The lock on my bedroom door had been broken. It was one of those push locks, and I just noticed one night that it didn't work. The door would still click open from both sides, but I had put it off for all that time because it just didn't seem important. I lived alone, so I didn't have family members or roommates that I was trying to keep out of my room. As long as all the main entrance doors were locked, my bedroom door really shouldn't matter. The hassle of buying a new one and changing it out just seemed really unnecessary. That being said, sometime later in the night, I woke up suddenly. My heart was beating quickly for some reason, and although the house was pitch black and quiet, I could faintly see that my bedroom door was cracked open. I could feel the alarms going off in my head, but at the same time, I knew there was a chance the door just didn't close properly and happened to make its way open. Maybe the cold winds slightly shifting the house caused it. I got out of bed and walked over, not wanting to turn the lights on, hoping I could just close it and get back to sleep. I shut it and double-checked it was latched in the doorway, then got back in bed. But as I laid there, I could tell something in me wasn't satisfied, like my gut knew there was more to this. I kept opening my eyes and looking around the room, although seeing nothing but shadows filling every corner. I probably stubbornly laid there, hoping to pass out eventually, for 30 minutes, before something moved in the house. I heard it, like a shuffle on the floorboards, either downstairs or in the hall outside my room. I leaned my body up and tried to listen, but there wasn't anything else. I was frozen, sitting up in my bed and not making a sound for a while. I was worried that if I got up and moved, then I wouldn't hear it again, or wouldn't be able to determine what it was. And eventually, I continued listening, but laid back down. I waited and listened for a long time, and don't even remember falling asleep. Didn't realize it until I woke up suddenly again, heart beating quickly just like before. And when my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw the same thing. My bedroom door was cracked open. I laid there staring at the gap in the doorway, looking at the darkness beyond it. Obviously, the hallway light was off, so it was just a deeper black outside of my room. I tried to tell myself it must have been the house again, or that maybe it didn't latch the way I thought it did. But that explanation didn't sit right this time, because I was very aware of how intentionally I closed it last time I got up. I started to get out of bed to walk over there again, but just as I swung my legs out of the covers, something shifted behind the door frame, like someone had moved out of the darkness between the crack in the doorway. I froze up again. I didn't hear anything though. No footsteps walking away. Nothing. Just the wind making the house creak. I didn't know if whoever the hell was right outside that door was still there, or if they were watching me, or what they were going to do. I stood motionless and quiet for 5 whole minutes, but it felt like hours, before I quickly ran to the door and slammed it closed, pressing all of my body weight into it to keep them out. But he didn't try to push it back open. There were maybe 15 seconds of silence, and then I heard soft, dull footsteps slowly move down the hallway and down the stairs. Sounded like he went toward the back door, and then it was quiet again. I quickly called the police, and thankfully I can say nothing else happened during the 10-ish minutes I waited for the police to make it and search the house. They took down a lengthy report of the whole night and everything I knew, which wasn't much, and they searched the home, but found nothing. However, as we were standing in the kitchen talking about what happened, I glanced toward the back door, explaining that's where I last heard his footsteps moving toward. And I saw him again. His silhouette standing in the trees behind my backyard. He moved away quickly before the officers could look.
he was probably standing out there watching us through the windows from afar, which is insanely creepy and unsettling. I spent that night at a friend's house, as well as the next few days. Over the few weeks afterward, I didn't really get any more news from the police, but the snow cleared up a bit, and I found some even more unsettling things in the back forest behind my home. There were these faint and rugged trails through the woods, like from someone having walked the same way over and over, and the trail led right up to the back of my house. Whoever this guy was, he'd been stalking me for a while, long enough to have even naturally made a footpath in the forest. And probably the most disturbing find was that the way he broke in was likely through one of the back windows, which I found didn't lock correctly. Kinda like my bedroom door. Could just be a coincidence, but seeing as he'd been stalking me for a while, there's a chance that that night wasn't the first time he was in my house. And the broken lock on my bedroom door might have not been some random unrelated occurrence either. Needless to say, I moved out and far away from there. I just really hope I wasn't followed. I know right now as I'm writing this, it's the middle of winter, but this actually happened a few months ago on Halloween. I wasn't sure if I wanted to share this, but after debating it for a while, I decided I might as well, just in case it helps someone else not fall for the same situation I did. I live in a really old apartment building on the outskirts of town, which wasn't necessarily a bad area, but it was definitely far from being nice. It was where most who couldn't afford to live in the city end up settling down at, since all the houses and buildings were built in the early 1900s, so they were cheap. My apartment had been renovated a few times, but overall it was still noticeably in bad shape. A ton of the people living in the other units moved out in just the last couple years, and all the rooms were left vacant. I don't think whoever owned the building ever tried to rent out the rooms. Maybe they wanted people to move out. I don't know. They just left the empty rooms there, and after a while, I genuinely think I was the only one still living in that building. It felt like every time I walked in or out through the halls, I never heard a single sound or saw anyone at all. It was just an empty, forgotten building that somehow I was the only one still living in. I distinctly remember a month or so before this event, I had tossed some stuff in the dryer before walking out of the building to head to work. And down all 3 stories of the building, I could hear my dryer rumbling through the walls, filling the silence in the staircase and the hallways. That's how quiet and vacant it was. Anyway, I worked on Halloween. And being older and living in an apartment, there wasn't much for me to celebrate. Obviously, kids don't go trick-or-treating inside apartment complexes. Not that anyone else lived here anyway. So I tossed my work stuff on the floor and just sat on the couch to maybe watch a horror movie, or pull up a Halloween-themed video on YouTube. It was around 9 p.m. when the sudden knock at the door to my unit nearly had me paralyzed from how much it startled me. 3 loud knocks, and then it was just quiet. And they were definitely at my door. I got up, still shaken and confused, that not only was this the first I'd heard of anyone being in the building for months, but also that they were at my door. I walked over and cracked the door open, and was even more confused. There was a kid. She was wearing a Halloween costume and holding up a bag. I must have stared at her for a whole 10 seconds, frozen and trying to figure out what the hell was going on. The girl didn't say anything either, She just stood there, looking at me through her mask. The bag she held up was empty, no candy in it, and I felt bad that I didn't have any to hand out, but I was more focused on figuring out where she even came from. How did you get in here? Do your parents live in this building? She didn't speak, didn't really seem fazed by the question either, honestly had no emotion. I leaned my head into the hallway and looked down past the girl. No one else was out there. No parents, no other kids. It was dead silent in the whole building. I was about to ask another question, but she suddenly turned away and walked down the hall to the staircase and left. I stood there for a minute, hearing her go down the stairs and seemingly out of the building. Didn't knock on any other doors or stop at any rooms. Something was really strange about that. I closed and locked my door behind me, but I felt like I needed answers. All these months of not hearing or seeing a single person or sign that anyone else was in this building, and then suddenly one night a girl shows up at my door. It just didn't seem right. I spent a few minutes trying to look out the windows at the parking lot in front of the building, but my car was the only one there, just like it always was, and no one else was outside. It was dark and vacant. After a few more minutes of thinking about it, I threw on my jacket and decided to head out to look around. I went into the hallway, stopping to listen for a moment, then walked down to the staircase. As I walked downstairs, the building seemed just as dead as usual. No signs of anyone else on any of the other floors. When I got down to the bottom, I looked outside from the front door. The girl was definitely gone now, and there was no one near the building whatsoever. I know it was Halloween, but this kinda had me legitimately creeped out. And as I was closing the front door, I noticed something else. The keypad next to the door had a blinking light. Now, this was just one of those old keypads with the buzzers that I guess used to work, but since I'd been there, it wasn't functional. I always used my physical key, and even if you press the buttons on the keypad, it wouldn't light up or show any signs that it was working. I assumed it was completely disconnected. So seeing the light suddenly on and blinking was pretty strange. I closed the door and tested to see if it locked, thinking maybe the blinking light meant the door wasn't locking properly. But it seemed to lock just as usual, so I started heading back up to my unit. I didn't like the feeling of being outside of my room, not with the strange things going on this night. I walked up past the first floor, and then the second, but stopped in my tracks as I passed the hallway. I backed up and looked down it, confirming what I saw out the corner of my eye. One of the unit doors was open. That had just happened during the couple minutes between me walking downstairs and coming back up. Hello? My voice echoed down the hall, and there was not a sound in response. A chill hit my body, and I quickly hurried up to my room, getting in and closing the door behind me. I felt like my whole body went into panic mode for a second. I took a deep breath and started to walk into the living room, before sudden loud knocks hit the door behind me. I hadn't even been inside for 10 seconds. I called out hello again as I stared at the door. The person knocked again, but didn't say anything. I quietly walked up to the other side of the door, and I looked out the peephole. I saw a man. He had full black clothing and a hood draped over his face. He hit the door again and stood right up to the door, like he was pressing on it, so that as soon as I turned the handle, the door would fly open. I took a few steps back, and suddenly I heard something else. Footsteps from the outside hallway. There was more than one. I heard them start whispering, but all I could hear were low mumbles through the thin walls. I could feel that whatever this was wasn't over. I got my phone and dialed 911, then tried to find a place to hide. It was just a one-bedroom, tiny apartment, so my options weren't great. I decided to go out onto the balcony, which had blinds covering it. And not a minute later, there was a slight thump inside the building, and then I saw light slowly shine into the room as the door creaked open. I was looking through the small cracks between the blinds. Two men walked in and started looking around. My heart was racing. They were inside for a while, even coming right up near the blinds to the balcony, but eventually left. I waited out there in the cold for 10 minutes before cops got there. No one else was inside the building, and from the investigation, I did find out that I was the only one living in the building still, at least legally. No one else should have had access aside from the owner. But I didn't get many answers as to what was really going on. It felt like the men had used the little girl to condition me to open the door, so that when they knocked, I wouldn't think twice and would just open the door. I moved out in the following days, and it seemed like after moving away, everything died out. The police stopped giving any updates, and the whole situation faded into nothing. I don't know what those men wanted from me, or what was really going on in that building, and I'm thankful I didn't have to find out that night. I used to work the night shift at a small shipping warehouse right outside of town. It wasn't a big place, just a long concrete building with 3 loading docks, a tiny office, and endless rows of metal shelving. Most nights, it was only me and 1 or 2 other guys, but the company cut hours during the slow season, so for a few weeks, I was completely alone from midnight to 6 a.m. I didn't think much of it at first. I guess the peace and quiet was nice, and the job was easy enough. I kept my earbuds in most of the night and tried to not think about how quiet it was. Heavy machines that ran all day were silent at night, so even the smallest noise echoed. This night in particular was very quiet. No cars driving on the highway outside or even wind hitting the building. From inside, I could hear the soft sound of crickets in the forest that was just beside the building, because there was nothing to drown out the noise. At some point early in my shift, I put my earbuds in and worked for a good while without stopping. I was in the far back corner, scanning a pallet, when I heard something that made me stop. Footsteps. Light ones. Not hurried or heavy, but almost definitely footsteps. They came from the front of the warehouse, near the office. At first, I thought my boss might have stopped by without texting me, which has happened before, and gave me as good of a scare as you'd imagine. I took my earbuds out and listened again, but now there was nothing. After a minute, I told myself I imagined it, but then just as I started getting back to work, I heard them again. Just a few footsteps, slow and spaced out, like whoever it was wasn't sure where they were going. "John? That you?" I called out my boss's name, but he didn't call back, and the footsteps seemed to stop too. I walked toward the front, trying to act like I wasn't nervous. The warehouse lights didn't reach the office area that well, leaving that part of the building dim and shadowy. I flipped on the office light and checked inside. I even checked the break room and found nothing. Didn't know what else to do other than shake it off and get back to work. Usually, I didn't get worked up about stuff like this, so I knew either tonight I was just feeling off or something was actually off about the warehouse. Another hour went by, and I'd finished scanning what I needed to and headed back to the office to log everything and check on a couple of things. Like I said before, the office was kind of in the back corner of the building. I sat down and started doing all the boring computer work of just clicking through things and adjusting the numbers from the scans. I was in there no more than 5 minutes when, for some reason, I looked up at the hallway window, the one that overlooked the warehouse floor. Someone was walking between the shelving rows. Just a silhouette, barely visible, but I felt like even from the quick half look I saw, the movement was clearly someone walking. I stood up so fast the chair tipped over, and I shouted hey at them to try to get them to stop. My voice resonated down the warehouse, but after they disappeared out of view behind the shelf, I didn't see anything. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find to defend myself, some old metal tool from the desk, and stepped outside the office. I started slowly walking down, and I kept calling out something along the lines of, "Who's here?" and "You can't be in here," over and over. No matter how hard I tried to fake it, my voice didn't sound confident at all. I moved aisle by aisle, checking corners and even looking behind boxes where a grown adult couldn't possibly be hiding, and yet I still found no one. Eventually, I made it to the far back wall, and every row behind me was empty. I sort of stared at the warehouse with this blank stare, trying to understand this. The only other place I could look were the couple side hallways that I guess if it really was a person I saw, they could have snuck into, but I felt like I would have heard the heavy metal doors opening and closing. But there was no way I'd be able to get back to work without checking. I opened one of the doors and looked down. This area I hadn't really been to. I think it led to all the manager's offices and stuff like that I had no business ever being in. I didn't see anyone though, so I turned around and let the door start closing behind me. And just when I did, I heard the sound of a door opening from down the corridor. I quickly spun around and grabbed the door before it shut, looking down the hall again. There was a man now, standing right at the end of the corridor. He looked early 20s, but not like the normal young guy you usually see. He looked disheveled and crazy, eyes wide open enough for me to see them from all the way down at the other end of the hall. I don't know if he was on something or what, but it was horrifying and disturbing the way he looked at me. I called out, asking what he was here for, and telling him he needed to go. The guy didn't even look like he comprehended what I said. I called out again, trying to sound more aggressive, and mentioning that I'd called security, which was a lie, but I hoped it would work. He started taking a few steps forward. I couldn't tell if he was complying with me or just trying to close the distance, so I just stood in the doorway trying to talk to him still. Think it was when he was about 15 to 20 feet away that I noticed something in his hand, and by the time I looked back up at his eyes, he lifted his arm and hurled it at me, chucked it with all of his strength, sending it flying right at my head, only missing me by a couple of inches and hitting the door frame beside me. It was a hammer or a large metal wrench. The harsh metal echo it made when it hit the door frame felt like it burst my eardrums. I immediately turned and booked it out of there, hearing the guy chase me like his life depended on it. I looked over my shoulder a couple times, seeing him still just 10 to 15 feet behind me, with that horrifying look in his eyes. I made it to the office and locked myself in, hearing him slam his body into the metal door and try opening it. Luckily, this office was solid, only having that metal door and the window, which was the super sturdy kind. like maybe 4 inches thick of heavy-duty glass that isn't supposed to shatter in a rough work environment. The guy moved around to the window and started ravagely slamming his shoulder into it and punching it. He looked absolutely insane, but he eventually realized he couldn't break in and turned around and just walked away, slowly making his way down to the other end of the building and I'm assuming out the back door. I was already using the office phone to contact the police by this point, but it took forever for them to get to the warehouse, so the guy really could have been anywhere by this point. This wasn't some fancy new warehouse either, so the cameras were awful. It showed us the guy breaking into one of the doors and walking around, almost stalking me during my whole shift, but there were no clear views of his face to identify him with. Wasn't any way to know why he broke in or was trying to attack me either. I stayed at that job for a while afterward, and the event almost started to not even feel real because of how crazy it was. Eventually, though, I did leave and get a similar gig somewhere else, figuring it wasn't worth hanging around with the chance the guy could come back looking for me.